So now we're going to cover the different types of stationary points. So we're going to go over what the definition of a stationary point is, in case you don't know. How to find stationary points, very basically. I'm going into this in more detail in the next video, so if you want to learn how to do that, next video. Different types of stationary points, and absolute maximum and absolute minimums. So we know that the derivative is the gradient, and we can think of it as a gradient calculator. So if this is the function, this is f of x, this thing here is our gradient calculator. That is the same as having a calculator which calculates gradient. Boom. So stationary points. A stationary point means where the gradient of the curve equals 0. So that's all of these things here. And how do we find that? Well, we find that by making the derivative equal 0 and solving for x. That's all you do. More details in the next video. Types of stationary points. So you can have a local maximum, a local minimum, a point of inflection, an absolute minimum, and an absolute maximum. So local means located in a certain area. So this is your home. You have your local shop. It's in your certain area, whatever area you may live in. So if we're looking at a curve like this, and we look at a certain area like this little blue bit here, that would be the local maximum. Here we'd have another local minimum. Here we'd have a local maximum. And here we'd have a local minimum. They're the minimums or the maximums for that particular area. Or you can just think of them as the peak, different small peaks, which might not necessarily be the highest point on the graph, but there's still bits where their curve actually has a 0 gradient. So if you looked at it overall, that would be the absolute minimum, and that would be the absolute maximum. So even though this is a local maximum, it's still not the highest point. It's just a maximum for that area. So an absolute minimum is the lowest point on the graph. It's the absolute minimum. Can't get more minimum than that, right there. The absolute maximum is the highest point on the graph, which is there. And you find the absolute maximum or minimum best by sketching the graph, because if you try to just find points where the gradient equals 0, that might not be the highest or lowest point. So sketch the graph, you can then see it and then go, ah, there it is. So a point of inflection is where the curve bends but does not change direction overall, like that. Flex means bend, like flexible. That's why it's called a point of inflection. A point of inflection is where the curve bends, but the gradient doesn't have to be 0. So if we look at something like this, the lowest gradient it has is about half or something. So this actually doesn't have a stationary point in it. So you might not come across them, but just be aware that they exist. Whereas a stationary point of inflection is a point of inflection where there is an actual stationary point where the gradient actually equals 0. So those are the two different types of points of inflection, ones which have gradients that equal 0 and ones which don't, basically. And as a summary, there's your local maximum, there's your local minimum, there's your point of inflection, absolute minimum, absolute maximum. You find stationary points for f of x by making f dash of x equals 0 and solving for x. And that's it. I hope this helps.